Hello again, everyone. So this is going to be the final video that I'm going to post today. And today we're going to look at, for this video, we're going to look at the causes of the First World War. Now, the First World War is a topic that I personally find very, very fascinating. Basically, it's in many ways the dawn of it really marks the beginning of the 20th century in many ways. It's the first war to feature, it's really the first modern mechanized industrial war. It's the first war to feature aircraft. It's the first war to have submarines used in large numbers. It's a war that sees the development of poison gas and chemical weapons. And it's a war that sees the development of the tank, amongst other things. But those are just on the technical side. Even more significantly than the technical developments that occurred during the First World War, World War I is important because it really kind of, for the lack of a better way of putting it, it's the grandfather of every modern conflict that we have fought in the century since, or the majority of them at any rate. Almost every modern conflict, from conflicts in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa, of course World War II, can be traced in some way or shape or form to the First World War. So I think it's a very important war to understand, and I think it's a war that, until fairly recently, most Americans didn't take a big interest in because we kind of came in at the tail end of it. We didn't declare war on Germany until April of 1917, and our troops didn't really begin fighting until a year later, only really seeing frontline combat for the last 6 months of the conflict. But nonetheless, in spite of that late entry and in spite of that comparatively late role for the United States, it's a war that in many ways makes the United States a global power in a way that it hadn't been before. It really marks the emergence of the United States as a major, major player on the international stage. Um, so it's worth examining why the war happened. And this is going to end up taking us a little bit beyond our borders here as we look at this, because, of course, the United States didn't cause World War One. And naturally, as a neutral power, didn't enter the war until fairly late. Um, but it is important to understand why the war happened. And World War One is a little bit more of a complex war to explain than World War Two. World War Two, you have very clear-cut good and bad guys. Obviously the Nazis are bad. You know, with World War One, it's a little bit different. There isn't as much of a clear-cut good and bad guy, but there are very definitive. Sorry again. My little helper likes to try to help me with these videos, um, but anyway. Um, so the World War One, there's actually a multitude of, you know, potential people you can blame for the war. And you can't really divvy out blame, to any one more than another in this sense. Um, but fundamentally, World War One is a result of two things. The first is imperialism in the late 19th century, and the nationalism it inspires. And the second cause of World War One is ethnic rivalries within Europe itself and beyond. So you have ultimately this very toxic brew of imperialism, nationalism, and ethnic tensions that eventually brings the world crashing into a global conflict in the late summer of 1914. Um, so let's start with the imperialism aspect of it. Um, the imperialism aspect of it is actually can go back to the late 19th century. Remember, we were talking about like the Philippine insurrection and the Spanish-American War. There was this what many called the Great Game afoot between European colonial powers as well as eventually Japan and the United States to establish colonies in Asia and Africa, um, particularly in Africa, in the case of Britain, France, and Germany, as well as Belgium. And many countries saw establishing these overseas colonies as a mark of their national prestige, the way by which they were measured in the international community. The problem is that by the early 20th century, there weren't many places left to conquer for many of these countries. And so you get situations by the turn of the 20th century, by the first decade of the 20th century, where many of these competing imperial domains are butting up against one another, such as the case between the British and the Germans in East Africa, the British colony of Kenya and the German colony of Tanzania, butting up against one another. And that periodically produces major tensions between those powers. And you see a similar thing in Asia with, of course, the Japanese and various other European powers competing for access to certain parts of China to carve out their own spheres of influence in China, and what have you. So there's this so imperialism is a big cause of World War One, an indirect cause, but a cause nonetheless, as these expanding European colonial empires begin butting up against one another and producing tensions with one another. Um, but that tension isn't just limited to the periphery of their colonial possessions. There's also a great deal of internal tension in Europe between great powers over their respective boundaries. Um, for example, France and Germany have increasing tension with one another because of the boundary shifts that occurred as a result of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, which saw significant portions of France being surrendered to Germany, the regions of Alsace and Lorraine being surrendered to Germany. Um, and then in Eastern and Central Europe, you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is kind of this dying empire in Central Europe that comprises a multitude of ethnicities and different languages within its boundaries. Within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you have obviously Austrians and Hungarians who speak German and Hungarian, respectively. But you also have Croatians, Serbians, you have Romanians, you have Poles, um, you have Czechs, Slovaks. You have all these different ethnicities, all these different linguistic groups existing within this empire. And many of those linguistic and ethnic groups increasingly want their own countries. They want their own government. They don't want to be yoked to this faraway empire that doesn't really care about them or concern itself much with them. And so that leads to this rise of nationalism in those countries, which you also see in many great powers as well. And then, of course, you have Russia in Eastern Europe. Russia regards itself as the protector of Eastern Christendom, of the Eastern Orthodox faith. And so the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, who is a fiercely religious individual, okay, now the other one is jumped up here, who is a fiercely religious individual, he sees himself as the anointed protector of Eastern Christendom. And so he seeks a further entry into Eastern Europe, particularly in the Balkans. Um, and that puts him in direct collision with the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Central Europe, who see his attempts to expand as being basically at their expense, which, to be fair, they are. Um, so that's one aspect of it, is this, kind of the imperial. So there's a couple aspects of it, actually. The imperial competition between primarily between Britain, France, and Germany, and then the internal competition within Europe itself between Russia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire's attempts, largely unsuccessful attempts, to deal with nationalism and emerging nationalist movements within their own empire. Um, then you have arms races. As all of these things begin to mount in Europe during the early 20th century, almost all of these countries, in fact, begin dramatically increasing the size of their militaries. Now, it varies what they focus on depending on what kind of country they are. For example, the British and the Germans enter into a naval arms race with one another around 1906 when the British launch HMS Dreadnought. The Germans were trying to challenge the British, who had long had the world's most powerful navy, as a great naval power, which was seen by the British as the anchor of their uh, overseas imperial possessions. And so there's this great naval arms race between Britain and Germany that begins around the turn of the century, 1905, 1906, and continues all the way up until the First World War begins. Um, then there's a competition for having the biggest land army in Europe. And once again, that kind of lingering bitterness between the French and the Germans from the Franco-Prussian War leads both of those countries to begin amassing, building massive armies. By 1914, France and Germany both have armies well in excess of 2 million men and can call millions of men more to service from the vast national reserves that both countries produce. So there's this arms race. There's growing nationalism within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and amongst many of these, and amongst and against these various countries. There's imperial possession. The final element is alliances. As part of an effort to actually prevent a general European war, prevent war from these increasingly, armed to the teeth power blocks from going at one another, the respective power blocks eventually decide to form alliances. And so you get one group that calls itself the Triple Entente, which includes the UK, France, and Tsarist Russia, that sign a treaty with one another and which, form an alliance. And then you have another alliance called the Triple Alliance that forms between Austria-Hungary and Germany and Italy. Italy would eventually leave this pact and actually join the Allies for entirely self-interested reasons to gain territory in 1915. But the basic idea behind these respective power blocks was pretty simple. The Triple Entente, France, Germany, or France, Britain, and Russia, pledge to one another mutual defense if one is attacked. So that what that means is that if, for example, Germany attacks Russia, then Germany is no longer just at war with Russia. Germany is also at war with France and the UK as well. Similarly, if one of the Entente powers attacks a member of the Triple Alliance, who, for geographic reasons, come to be known during World War I as the Central Powers, then likewise, those countries are not just at war with either Germany or Austria-Hungary, they're at war with all of the other states. And so what this does, effectively, is it transforms potential conflicts from potentially relatively isolated and confined regional conflicts into general continent-wide conflicts that will eventually involve everybody. And so these secret treaties and these alliances, which were intended to prevent war, in the end actually become the thing that makes such a war inevitable and ends up transforming the relatively isolated circumstances that lead to the First World War from being a regional conflict into a full blown um, first European war, and by extension, because these are colonial powers that have empires around the world, a world war in short order. And the events happen in what historically had always been, and in many ways to this day remains, a backwater, the Balkans, in modern day Bosnia. Um, Basically, after the Ottoman Empire had been kicked out of the Balkans in the 19th century, um, there was formed a new state in the Balkans, the Kingdom of Serbia, which was filled with its own brand of nationalists who wanted to unite all of the peoples, all the peoples of the Balkans, all the soft Slav peoples. Which is what they wanted. They called it Yugoslavia. That's actually what that means. Is the kind of greater Serbia, the unification of all the Slavic ethnicities living in the Balkans area. And so the Serbians want to expand their pretty small kingdom in the Balkans to encompass other areas, including Croatia, Montenegro, Kosovo, and Bosnia Herzegovina. The problem with this is that Bosnia Herzegovina had recently come under the control of the Austro Hungarian Empire. And this produced tensions between Serbia and Austria Hungary that threatened to boil over into war. This was the Serbs claimed that this area was theirs by birthright. The Austro-Hungarians disagreed, and so basically, what ends up happening is into this tinderbox steps the apparent heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And Franz Ferdinand decides he's going to visit Bosnia Herzegovina, even though everybody's telling him that's a bad idea. You shouldn't do this. And so he goes there. While he's there, a group of Serb nationalists who call themselves the Black Hand, which is essentially a terrorist group, for the lack of a better way of putting it, they attack him. They throw bombs at his motorcade, but those bombs fail to kill him. But then, in one of the greatest and most consequential pure accidents of history, Archduke Franz Ferdinand decides he's going to visit some of his wounded aides who had been wounded in the bomb attack in the hospital. On the way to the hospital, his driver makes a wrong turn down a street in Sarajevo. He ends up in front of a cafe where is seated a dejected Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip, who had been part of the failed bombing attempt. Seeing the Archduke sitting literally 10 feet away from him, Princip leaps from his table, pulls out a .32 caliber pistol, fires 2 shots, killing the Archduke and his wife Sophie. Immediately after this, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, understandably, is upset with Serbia, and they arrest Princip, put him in jail. He eventually dies in jail in 1918 because of basically being forgotten there. And they then begin demanding concessions from the Serbians. They issue a series of ultimatums. This initiates what's known as the July Crisis. At this point, it appears that war between Serbia and Austria-Hungary are inevitable. Now, under normal circumstances, that wouldn't have been that big of a deal. Serbia's a minor power, and the Austro-Hungarians are a empire that is in swift decline. So this would have, in all likelihood, under normal circumstances, been a pretty short regional conflict between two comparatively insignificant powers. But instead, what ends up happening is that when Serbia makes its ultimatum, or when Austria-Hungary makes its ultimatum to Serbia, um, with which it has the full backing of the German government. Uh, Russia's czar decides to intervene, and he says, "Well, if you attack Serbia, I'm going to mobilize my army and I'm going to attack Austria-Hungary," which of course means that Germany will also attack Russia, and that of course threatens to bring in a lot of other countries in Europe. So very quickly, this all spirals out of control and threatens to become a general European war in a very short period of time. Um, in the end, Austria-Hungary, again with the backing of Germany, does attack Serbia, at which point Russia attacks Austria-Hungary. Um, and so within a matter of days, in early August of 1914, pretty much all the Europe goes to war with one another. When Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia, Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary. Germany then attacks Russia and France simultaneously by invading neutral Belgium, and this in turn brings the British into the war, thus bringing the war full circle. So um, those are pretty much the rather confusing circumstances that bring about the First World War. Now, once all of this begins, the war actually initially seems to go very well for the Germans. They're able to quickly march through much of Belgium and advance to within 60 miles of the French capital, Paris. At that point, in September of 1914, a combined French-British army holds back the German advance at the First Battle of the Marne. Um, at this point, the war in the Western Front becomes static, and both sides dig in and begins constructing a elaborate network of trenches that will stretch all the way from the North Sea near the Dutch border to the Swiss borders in the border in the Alps. More than 400 miles of trenches. Um, and once those trench lines are completed in the autumn of 1914, they will effectively remain in place for much of the next 4 years, with each side launching one pointless assault after another against over the next several years, assaults that ultimately will produce casualties in the millions, and which eventually will create a political situation that eventually will bring in the United States into the conflict. And that is what we will talk about in our next video.